Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the Deadzones for Meet Your Maker. This is specifically on the Xbox Series X, just in case other platforms may differ. But start with the camera has a 15% circular deadzone. 15% is a pretty middle to high deadzone size. It is quite a bit lower than many other games' defaults though. So this will feel a bit more responsive just by default. But we have full diagonal movement. So if you move your stick right around the axes, you'll be able to see this reflected. So if I'm just below this axis, I'm moving slowly downward, just above it, slowly upward. And this is very obvious when capping your view like this and looking for horizontal movement. You can see that the direction flips when passing over the axis. The movement is the exact same. Movement starts very slow, so it might not be too clear, but what is clear is the gun also shifts in the direction once you break out of the dead zone. So you can see forward, back, some diagonal directions. And to demonstrate the diagonal movement here, you can use this as a reference. So you can see that if I'm just to the right, I'll begin veering off to the right of this reference, and if I'm just to the left, I'll be veering off from these edges. So we have the same full diagonal movement for movement. So this is off to a good start, but it's even better because they have deadzone options. So 15 is not only the default, but also the maximum. And this could be, the maximum could be higher just for players that need it, but this isn't a real big issue. So demonstrating the minimum. Change the graphs. So for the camera, now at 0%, you get a true 0% dead zone, so any stick movement will create camera movement. And you still have the same full diagonal movement you had before. Movement is very close, though I wasn't able to see movement occur until about 2%. And that includes with the gun moving in the direction that you're moving. So as you can see here, the gun's idling, but I had to move the stick just slightly before you can start seeing it lean towards a direction. So this was only about 2%. This could be an issue with just me being able to notice movement, but at 2%, this is a very small issue, and it was accurate at 15% value. Before getting into the curves, I'm just going to raise this back up to 15 so I'm not slowly drifting all over the place. So by default, the curve is actually standard, but I have it set to linear just to demonstrate the dead zones a little more easily. But starting with that, we can actually see that the curve is not actually linear after testing. It's a quadratic curve, so it starts pretty slow and then builds up to the maximum turn rate nearing the end. This is the case with all three curves. So a standard, you can see this is really great that it has these visuals for it. But standard, you have almost like a shallow kind of circular, like symmetrical kind of curve. And this too starts out slower than the graph shows. So it's significantly slower, and then it is until you move the stick further where it starts steeping up more dramatically until you hit the maximum turn speed. Same thing with dynamic. You can see here it's a perfectly symmetrical S-curve, so at under 50%, you have basically slower than linear, and over 50% you have faster than linear. But here, you can see that the initial portion is much slower, and it is until you move further where you can start seeing it steep up faster, and then taper off into its S shape until it hits its maximum. So this is probably not specifically on the developers. The curves they've applied are probably perfectly accurate to these graphs. What seems to be the case here is there's probably an underlying quadratic curve that was there as a preset or something, and they've just built these curves on top. So a linear wouldn't change that, so the quadratic would be expressed, and it would just slow down these other types of curves. So that's one thing that needs to be corrected just to make these options accurate, is just remove that underlying quadratic curve, and then these should be accurate. However, these curves appear to be set up per axis rather than per magnitude, and that means that per magnitude means that the curve is set up based on the distance from the center, whereas per axis is based on individually from the distance from the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. And that has effects on the diagonal sensitivity as well as the direction the cursor will move in. So I don't know if the underlying quadratic curve is set up one way or the other, but looking at the linear curve, so normally you can see the sensitivity for left and right, and then up and down. Normally, when set up per axis, this will make your diagonal sensitivity slower, but we can see here that it doesn't seem too noticeable. Quadratic curve wouldn't be too dramatically different. So it could be that the underlying quadratic curve is set up by magnitude. But the other thing to look for is the diagonal movement. So you can see that I'm bobbing around the axis, and I'm getting some pretty strong bobbing motions. And if I move the stick fully, you can see that that is still being reflected here. But if I switch over to the standard curve and look left and right, then up and down, you might be able to see clearer that the diagonal sensitivity is noticeably slower. And if not, the bobbing test will make that clear. So I'm making these same large bobbing motions, about 50% around the vertical axis, and you can see how reduced it is. And this is because the curve is being set up around both the horizontal and vertical axes, and the vertical axis is starting so slow that there's not enough vertical movement occurring yet to make noticeable bobbing motions. And if this were set up by magnitude, both these curves would look exactly the same with maximum tilt movements. For dynamic, because of the shape, this would actually warp the diagonals to be slower with smaller movements, but actually more dramatic diagonals with movements over 50%. Of course, with this changed, the slower curve because of the underlying quadratic, this isn't quite the case, but you can see that these bobbing motions are a bit faster than standard, not as quite as obvious as they were with linear. But if I make it a little bit larger movements, you can see that this is pretty dramatic because of that. It's starting to steep up faster. So that's something that needs to change. So getting rid of the underlying quadratic curve and then just resetting these curves up based around the center of the magnitude rather than each axis would solve the diagonal sensitivity and the alterations to the angle. The horizontal and vertical sensitivity are the same, which is good. Some games have the vertical sensitivity weighted lower, so even if you have them the same, the vertical sensitivity is still slower. Not the case here. They're exactly the same. Another thing with the curves, though, is that the standard curve appears to be about 10% slower than the linear and dynamic curves, and this was consistent between the entire sensitivity range, so the default sense, the maximum sense, and the minimum sense. The standard curve was 90% slower. This could be the specific function they're using for that, or some other issue. That's sort of minor, but that could be corrected too to perfectly match the other two curves. Another thing is, while curve options are excellent, I'm always an advocate for sliders over presets, just because you have much more granular control over that. In this case, these are completely different functions, so a slider wouldn't be able to give you all of these. But what could be done is have an additional slider for the intensity of each type of curve. So instead of linear, they could offer a power function which could range with a slider from linear to cubic, and that would give you a huge range of control. It could make standard, this isn't the power function specifically, but it might make this a little redundant. But with dynamic, you have an S-curve here, and there are also forms of S-curves that can give you similar smooth control from linear to a very strong S-curve. So these could be a type, and then an additional slider could be added to give very granular control over the specific type of curve. What they have here is excellent, but more granular control is always great too. When I tested these curves, I tested it at 0% dead zone and a 0% outer threshold, but I did attempt to test this at 25%. If you have it here, this means that the curve should cap at 75% and then just be a flat line from there on. But I tested a few points at linear to attempt to verify that, and it turned out, at least for that test, that I got the same exact values as expected for a quadratic curve, what it currently is. So at 100% outer dead zone, or 0% for this option. So it seemed like this option wasn't working properly, at least for the linear curve. I didn't test the other two, but this may not be working properly, and if not, it should be corrected so it is working ideally. For aim assist, just looking loosely at it, this seemed to be a normal slowdown. So as your cursor passes over a target and you're close enough to them, the sensitivity will drop, and you'll get that. It didn't seem like there was any like tracking assist or any kind of bullet redirection assist. Maybe I just didn't notice that, but this just seemed to be a normal slowdown. So that about covers things. As a quick summary, it's great that this game uses circular dead zones, and we have dead zone options. A very slight improvement is just increasing the range of the dead zone to maybe like 30%, just so if players need that, they have access to it. Curve options are great, but the underlying quadratic curve needs to be removed, and these curves need to be set up per magnitude rather than per axis. And then maybe a secondary slider can be added to control the intensity of the types of curves. The outer threshold can be made to function if it doesn't work for the other curves as well. And that's about it. So the options in this game currently are great. It just needs those improvements to really be excellent. So hopefully those can be made. But that about covers it. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a good rest of your day.